Coming up, Community Secretary Robert Jenrick said this week that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak would not need to self-isolate after being in contact with COVID-positive Sajid Javid because of a pilot scheme replacing self-isolation with regular testing. Jenrick said the scheme is long-standing and well-known, just the latest lie from perhaps the most corrupt and dishonest member of the current cabinet. And believe me, that's a very high bar. Keep watching. If you enjoy these videos, please give us a like, subscribe and get notified of new videos every Wednesday and Saturday. After the new Health Secretary Sajid Javid tested positive for COVID this week, Boris Johnson and Chancellor Rishier than the Queen Sunak were both pinged by Dido Harding's Serco track and trace app. They announced that instead of self-isolating, like us proles are expected to do, they would instead take part in a pilot scheme that replaces self-isolation with daily testing. As this Johnson regime loves its slogans so much, we perhaps should use this one. It's one rule for us and another rule for them. Step up Robert Jenrick, who was interviewed on Sky News defending the indefensible.
You're right to say that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were contacted by NHS Track and Trace overnight, which shows that the system is working.
This doesn't show how well the app is working. It would be just part of this phenomenon being called the pingdemic because of the overly sensitive nature of the track and trace geofencing. It relies on Bluetooth technology, which was not designed to measure a 2-metre distance with any accuracy. Unlike the much cheaper test and trace app being used in Germany and other EU countries, which uses near-field communication, NFC, the same technology as used for contactless payment, and gives a far more accurate result. But with a £37 billion budget, Dido Harding thought that having NFC technology would have been setting unrealistic expectations. But back to Jenrick.
They're going to take part in a daily testing pilot, which is available to a range of organisations, not just to politicians.
This is his next lie. It's not available to a range of organisations. The pilot is being implemented in randomly selected organisations, and it's this very randomness that would make the results of the pilot scheme credible.
You can see what it looks like. It looks like one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us.
Well, as I say, this is a pilot that's actually being used by around 20 organisations, so hundreds, if not thousands, of public sector staff who work in those organisations will be able to use this pilot. We'll be learning from it, and of course if it's possible to roll it out more broadly because it's proven to be safe and successful, then we will do. But for the rest of us who are not yet part of that pilot, the crucial advice is, if you are contacted by NHS Test and Trace, to take that very seriously and to self-isolate.
Yep, one rule for us, another rule for them. It took less than 2 hours for the spin doctors in Downing Street to realise that national outrage was building, prompting Boris Johnson to announce that he would be self-isolating after all.
We did look briefly at the idea of us taking part in the pilot scheme, which allows people to test daily, but I think it's far more important that everybody sticks to the same rules, and that's why I'm going to be self-isolating.
Which of course left Robert Jenrick's earlier defence of the indefensible look even more pathetic. But this is just the latest in a string of lies, corruption and cronyism that has littered Jenrick's career. In May this year, Jenrick used the daily government COVID update to thank building construction company Taylor Wimpey, a major Tory donor. Brazen, a free primetime national advertising gift for his chums at Taylor Wimpey in return for hefty donations to the Tory party. This follows Jenrick's role looking after another major Tory donor last year in what has become known as the Westferry Scandal. This was a controversial £1 billion mixed-use building development on the Isle of Dogs in East London, headed up by ex-porn publisher cum property developer Richard Desmond. Shortly after attending a charity dinner with Desmond some days beforehand, Jenrick approved the scheme, overruling the local authority, Tower Hamlets, as well as London City Hall, plus the government's top planning inspector and local residents. Richard Desmond then made a £12,000 contribution to the Conservative Party 14 days after Mr Jenrick had approved the scheme. Not only does this whole matter stink of corruption, But the decision itself appears to be unlawful and has been referred to the police and for judicial review by Tower Hamlets local authority. The Met Police have so far refused to launch a probe into Jenrick's actions, and nor has the paperwork surrounding the Westferry approval process been released to the public by Jenrick's office. But it gets even worse. The timing of Jenrick's actions, coming just a day after local councillors had voted for a community infrastructure levy on developers, denied London's poorest borough £50 million, which would have otherwise have been due to help fund local authority housing and other infrastructure. Not a bad return on a £12,000 investment for Mr Desmond. You usually only get those sort of returns on donations to the Tory party when you're a PPE supplier during a pandemic. But this is not the most egregious example of Jenrick's corrupt, cronyist and grubby behaviour as a minister. In my opinion, his corrupt action in connection with the Towns Fund is even more reprehensible. The £3.6 billion Towns Fund was set up by the Tory government to give financial assistance to 100 of the most deprived boroughs in the country. Robert Jenrick's constituency of Newark is 270th on that list, way outside the top 100. But was nevertheless one of the winners of a £25 million grant from the fund. Jenrick even admitted that the decision had been made by a fellow junior minister, Jake Berry. And, hold on to your seat here, it turned out that Jenrick had also approved a grant for, wait for it, Jake Berry's constituency of Darwin. Jenrick has defended this arrangement as perfectly normal. What would be perfectly normal is for this sort of corruption to end up with the perpetrator being imprisoned.